Every semester we would go to New Orleans. And again, this is in 2009, 2010, 2011, years post Katrina. And our program just continued to emphasize, community, the things that different people are going through in the world that you don't know about, and how this all relates to sport. And that top picture where you see me in that pink dress, if you know the gentleman in the picture, one of them has a bow tie on, the other has a red shirt on under his suit. That's John Carlos and Tommy Smith, the famous Olympians who put their fist up during the Olympics, and we all see that picture today. And these experiences of being exposed to these different people in different situations were to teach us that no matter what industry you work in, you should always understand diversity, ethics, leadership, and service. You can want to work in ticketing, marketing, college athletics, sponsorship, activation. I have classmates who are doing some of everything now. And you should consider that. But every now and then, you get somebody who wants to be the founder of our program, Dr. Richard Lapchick, who's known as the social conscious of sport. He spent his life work doing this work. He recently got a SB a couple years ago, the Stuart Scott Inspiree Award honoree. But every now and then you get somebody who wants to be Dr. Lapchick, and that was me. I still want to be Dr. Lapchick. And so during my time in the program, I really wanted to be mentored by him. And I began, even back in 2010, to see that inclusion and belonging were essential, particularly in the spirit of sport. And I share this because this is, a decade before the murder of George Floyd and DE&I and every mainstream conversation. And then I kicked off my career. Well, you can go ahead and move forward. And I've done a lot in my career. I've worked for the NFL. I've been appointed by the mayor of Birmingham. I oversee D&IB for two major divisions at Penn. But there's one fundamental experience that really changed my approach to this work. You see me in sunny Grinnell, Iowa. That's what these pictures are in December 2013. And my role at Grinnell College was the coordinator of diversity and inclusion for athletics. This at the time was in 2012. I was one of the few in collegiate sports with a dedicated DE&IB role. And now almost anywhere you go, on an athletics website, you will see ADID, meaning a designee for DENIB. And that was not the case over 10 years ago. And when at the time I would share the work I was doing at Grinnell, which is a Division III college in very rural Iowa, people assumed that I was there for the Black and brown athletes. And that, to a certain extent, was true. But, even for me, it was eye-awakening to learn about the stories of how people ended up at Grinnell College and what they were hoping to do and who flocked to my work. These were first generation students who grew up in rural parts of the Midwest. There were some who were like from Chicago and DC, white, black, some of everything, right? And really just had to learn how to navigate a new space. And we had groups, even back then, athlete and allies who were for our LGBTQ plus students. We had students who were focused on their mental health. And it was really eye-awakening for me and others that we had student athletes of all kind of identities who felt isolated and who needed additional support, and not just isolated in the sense of their racial identity, but also in their dorms and their classrooms. I was on this accommodations committee, and that was like one of the biggest aha moments, because I thought, going into accommodations, we're going to speak about various abilities and disabilities. And, at the time, I can remember there being a large conversation about food allergies, and that we had students who weren't eating, and it literally was impacting their experience and their sense of belonging, because they had such severe allergies that if nuts were on the salad bar, that they couldn't eat that, but they also couldn't eat sandwiches because of this. And I as I share this, I just hope it gives insight that this work truly does touch everyone. And that was this fundamental experience for me in Grinnell. And my hope is that you understand I've been doing this work a long time. It's challenging work. And there's a lot to digest and maneuver through. And I hope that, as we expand all these letters, we add the B, we add the J, that if there's anything, it just comes back to really how people feel. And if Will, you want to move forward to the next slide. My hope today is that we think about a few things, a few different dynamics. Team success and exploring the role and belonging and achieving success, positive and negative emotions and how they impact team culture. That this work, I hope to share tools with you to make it easier to do this work, and that ultimately this is a shared responsibility. It is to have truly have an inclusive environment. We all have to be on the same page, and we have to want to understand how people feel and what support they need. So you've learned a little bit about me. You've heard my story. You've heard why I'm so passionate about this work and these fundamental experiences. So hopefully I can give you a little bit more understanding around some of these concepts as we continue to kick off the summit. Over to you, Will. So let's just start with breaking down belonging, right? Like they added the B on these DE&I initiatives, and perhaps we're not even all on the same page about what belonging means. But like shared with you all earlier as a doctorate student, definitions and research are important, and belonging isn't just about being included. It truly is about feeling safe to be your authentic self without fear. I'm sharing this slide particularly because research shows that a sense of belonging leads to increased motivation, mental health, and overall performance. That's how important belonging is to people. Social exclusion, like when we don't feel like we belong, on the other hand, activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. That's what the research tells us. And I hope when you all hear that, right, when you think about the same reactions in our brain as physical pain when we are excluded, I think that alone should be enough to think about the experiences that we create for others, for ourselves, and how we really pull people in. We can move forward well. The other thing I hope you understand is, and many of us know this, that the work didn't start, 5 years ago during that racial uptick, or even 40 years ago, right? This work has been done for a long time. And I'm listing these, scientists and researchers because I do want to point out a couple of things. Belonging has roots in our understanding of identity, and that research has been done for many, many years. So when we look at the work uh, of, of Erickson and Chickering and Freed, like, they laid the groundwork by discussing how identity develops through connections to group values, right? And so you'll see here in 1923, this work was being done, and some of the major takeaways was identity as the incorporation of an individual into a group setting and the associated process of how that person learns to interact within the group and other groups, right? So our identity is coming from how we maneuver in a group setting and what we're learning from people. This was discovered in 1923. As we move on to the work of Erickson, and I love kind of nerding out, and I won't do too much today about the work of Erickson, because Erickson started to explore like, okay, we know identity, but what about identity development? And Erickson found that identity development begins at birth, and it's shaped by significant developmental milestones and interactions. Erickson also started to do research about how does our cultural context play into this. At the time, Erickson was looking into religion, where you were born, how does all this impact your interactions? And the one thing that I love most when I think about this work that Erickson discovered was our adolescence is the most fundamental time where this all comes together. Then, of course, with any research, you have the work of Chickering. And Chickering, found and discovered and said that our authentic self and who we truly are measure up against our idealized self, meaning we define ourselves by figuring out whom we hold into high regard, how they feel about us, and how we manage reactions contradict our self image, right? And so, if you think about that, if you think about your athletes, your teammates, and if they hold you in the highest regard, how you react to them is going to impact how they show up. And again, sometimes people look at research and they're like, okay, it's research. But when you really think about our our sense of belonging, and how now people are saying belonging is one of the most leading impactful predictors of effectiveness of the work of DE&I, and how the spirit of belonging is rooted in our authentic expression. If we feel like we can't show up and be our authentic selves with the people that we hold in the highest regards, we're going to have a life of struggle. We're going to have these moments of struggle. We're going to have these things that we hear and see in the world. And it's just going to be continuing to figure out how we all navigate it together. In that, as we think about this, I want to move on, Will, to the idea of code switching. And so when we don't feel like we belong, we do a number of things. A number of things. One being code switching, right? And you hear this term being thrown out all the time. And again, this is adjusting behavior to fit into dominant spaces. Sometimes it's seen as a skill to be able to maneuver through spaces. But if this is something you feel like you constantly have to do and you don't feel like you can show up as your authentic self, it carries significant emotional labor and health impacts. Some of the research has shown that chronic stress from code switching can lead to increased cortisol, anxiety, cardiovascular problems. And this is like workplace research, this is family research of when I just feel like I can't be my authentic self. My health is starting to be impacted. My mental health is starting to be impacted. The work of having to continuously shift is it's an emotional labor and it's high. Again, I'm going to pause because this alone should be enough for us to simply just want to do better and create experiences and places for people to be their authentic selves. The research is deep, you all, and you can look into it, and you can really look into how code switching activates the body's stress response, and what that means. And so again, I'm hopeful as we lay the foundation of all the things that we learn, at the very least, we start thinking about what others may go through if they're not able to be their authentic self. Well, you can go ahead and move forward. And so, if what I just dropped in terms of the research, the dynamics, the impact is a little much to unpack. I can get it. So we can dial back a bit and just focus on positive and negative emotions. And I have a picture of Valerie Burton here. She is a infamous positive psychologist, right? Her life's work is in the spirit of positive psychology. And I heard her speak a couple months ago, and I had this other aha moment. And Valerie talks about how positive emotions can predict success, not just for teams, but individuals as well. And it can also build resilience, right? And so if we think about we want these resilient teams, we want these resilient boat houses, we want these resilient coaches, athletes, and even athletic cultures, right? We want cultures that sustain in our athletic sense, and we want them to continue to develop. Then positive emotion is what we want to continue to cultivate. Narrow thinking and negative Burton, yes, that's correct. Valerie Burton. Um, Negative emotions, uh, they narrow our thinking. They impact not just again team performance, but individual performance negatively. And if you think about your own self, I'm sure all of us, whether it's been the last year, the last 4 years, particularly in COVID times, you had your days where, like, you're in a particularly unhealthy space or negative space, or you're hitting a roadblock in your mind. And we know what that does to our ability to show up. We know what that does to our ability to even want to engage with folks, right? So if we're just thinking about it in the sense of positive and negative emotions, Valerie says we should aim for 3-to-1 positive to negative interactions, right? And so this means when we're thinking about our relationships, and we can think about it in the sense of our parents, our partners, our teammates, when you think about the saying, does good outweigh the bad? You really have to think about, for every negative interaction that somebody has or I have with them or that happens in my space, how am I outweighing this with positive moments? And so, again, when we think about this in our relationship, people are going to argue, people are going to disagree, people are going to have their moments. But you would hope if it's a healthy relationship, we're like, okay, that was a moment. How do I move past this? I think at the very least, us as administrators, coaches, teammates, people who are responsible for each other, we should think about these positive experiences and hopefully creating spaces of authenticity and belonging and inclusion and equity is a part of that. And so we can move forward, but like at the very least, I'm hoping we're thinking about emotions and team dynamics. And I really wanted to share the work of Valerie because I think it speaks to everything else that I've shared. But hoping that we walk away from here thinking about our positive experiences. In that, I want to share with you all some tools. Go ahead, Will, and move forward. So the first thing we should be thinking about, right, in this work is how are we creating a culture of feedback? I find that too often we're afraid to ask the hard questions. We're afraid to engage people. We're afraid to really assess like what's happening in my environment, right? And you simply can't be afraid. So I've seen people afraid to send surveys afterwards because they don't want the feedback. But if you don't know what's happening, you don't know how to support people. You don't know how to change the environment. So I have a couple easy things to do to create that culture of feedback. We can engage leaders regularly to understand team dynamics and morale. I coach up our coaches at Penn to always be speaking to your captains, your team leaders, people who aren't even captains, and have your moments where, of course, we're going to talk about what's happening on the water, but like just in general, like what's happening, in everyone's lives. What do I need to know? And of course, that's a relationship building tactic. Young people aren't always going to hop right out and say what they feel, but over some time, you'll figure out who's willing to speak up. And if it's not your leaders, I also encourage my coaches and administrators to identify people who you know are passionate for positive experience and change. Some of it is change in the spirit of DE&IB. Sometimes it's just people who wants everybody to get along and feel like they that sorry, I just got diverted by the chat. I'm gonna try not to do that. But feel like, that the team is a place where everybody belongs, and those are the people that you constantly want to be checking in. I talked about surveys a little bit, but you can conduct environmental scans, right? Look at who's clicking up with who. Look who's isolated. Look who's spending time with themselves, and really create opportunities for focus groups and areas for growth. And some of this work is about DE and IB. But I'll tell you all, and some of the work that I've done, some of it which is very visible. If you Google Penn Athletics or even Penn Rowing, you may come across that some of this was not about what you think diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging may be, and when we're in crisis, what that may mean. Some of it was bubbling up long before the major incident. So, for instance, with one of the teams I was working with, and they were a team that had a male side and a woman side, when it all came out and we were unpacking frustrations and where the lack of respect started, it was something as simple as like the women athletes feeling like the male athletes would not wait for them on the bus. If the bus was supposed to leave at 3, at 3:01, if the women weren't on the bus, instead of looking around and saying, like, all of our women aren't here, the men would be ready to send the bus. That little, act started a long list of acts that began to follow until we're in this place of extreme disrespect and harm, right? And that's what I mean by these environmental scans to understand what's happening. And we'll talk a little bit about shared responsibility, but this is why it all starts to come together, and you have to leverage stakeholder insights, right? And so this means, are we talking to our strength and conditioning coach, our athletic trainer, our alum, people who have experiences with our programs to understand it from all lenses? And are we actively seeking out that feedback? So number one thing you can do is create a culture of feedback to understand what does even belonging mean in the sense of the team. Go ahead, Will. And then, you have to be ready when things go wrong, as they sometimes will. You have to really think about how do we react to these moments. There's not going to always be places where people feel like they belong. And even when you've created that environment, which many of our coaches have, there's going to be people who challenge that environment. And a couple things I'll just note: you want to have a comprehensive plan for addressing a person who's caused harm and what accountability looks like for them. But you also want to make sure you have a plan for those who have been harmed. And in that, you have to understand the broader impacts, right? Often, when people have experienced harm, it's not just about them. There could be structural, historical, community impacts that bring people to have a vested interest of what happens next. And we see this when crises arise, whether it's at local elementary schools or middle schools or high schools or a university as large as Penn, right? Um, when incidents tend to happen, people will reach out and they want to know, like, what's your plan to fix this? And they didn't have to be in the moment. So you really do have to think about how is this going to impact everyone who is invested and supports our community. I encourage you to engage the internal experts. As I mentioned earlier, this might be counselors, this might be staff. Some of you all might have access to people like me in roles, but sometimes you have to reach out for external support. So there's organizations like Athlete Ally or A Long Talk who specialize in various perspectives. I know we're going to hear from some of those organizations today. And, they can be great partners in reconciliation and accountability and just continuing to have that conversation. And the final thing I'll say about when crises occur, you got to commit to ongoing work, right? I've worked with a couple of teams where they're like, well, nothing is happening in this moment. Nothing is happening right now, right? Like that incident was 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a year ago. My athletes seem fine, and it's almost like I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to spark feelings. But the process of ongoing work means, we're going to continue to have these hard conversations. We're going to continue to make sure everybody is okay, and we're going to continue to commit to this work in an ongoing way. So those are some initial crisis management strategies. And then the final thing I'll share with you is just around inclusive language and programming. So, when you're thinking about, like, well, what are the things we do to try to build community? I always encourage coaches and administrators to think about travel and post competition time for community building. And this could be, as simple as having a facilitated dialogue that is not relative to DE and IB. So people are just getting to know each other, right? And learning where people grew up or doing something fun together. But building that spirit of community that we truly are in on this together. And then when you think about once you've built that community, you can roll out things like inclusive language guides and community standards for inclusive behavior, like our norms, right? And so this could look as something as simple as 10 minutes after practice, us having conversation about the words people appreciate and don't appreciate, right? And how are we going to put this into our community norms to just really support each other and be on the same page about the language we use, the language we don't use, the norms that we appreciate in the community? How are we supporting each other when we speak? How are we actively listening? And just creating those spaces to have open and honest conversation through the spirit of community building. So when things get hard, and they sometimes will, that we are in it together. And so we'll go ahead into our final reflection and my call to action to you all over the next, course of the next 2 days. And I think a couple things. My hope today and just telling my story and why I'm so passionate about this work is I've been able to enter a lot of spaces that I thought I would never enter. You heard Grinnell, Iowa, you heard Indiana, you heard England, you heard Birmingham, Alabama, and there's so many other spaces. But I've been a beneficiary of people wanting to create a sense of belonging for me. And I think, if anything, right, I threw out all kind of literature and science and what harm does here. And what tools we can use. And I had a limited time to kick you all off, so I had to spit all of that at you. But if there's anything you leave from here, thinking, I want us, the number one, thinking about what our collective effort is and how it belongs with everybody, right? Like I shared some situations with you all earlier. That there are people who have stepped up and they truly believe, like, I could be the boathouse facility manager. It is my duty to make sure that everyone is having a sense of belonging and that I'm picking up on what people are experiencing. I'm the strength coach and I'm tapped in. I'm the head coach and I'm tapped in. I'm a donor and I'm tapped in. And I want us to think about the collective effort. And I really want us to think about how people feel and how we're ensuring that their voices are valued. What I want you all to think about every day is, what am I doing to cultivate joy and inclusion for the people around me? So you can dive into the research, you can look up the Valeries, you can look up, the century-year-old research that I've shared, but ultimately, I want you to pause and just simply think, what am I doing to cultivate joy? And I want you to remember that in creating belonging as a collective effort, and it's really up to all of us to make sure that everyone's voices feel heard. So thank you for allowing me to kick off. Thank you for allowing me to spend time, and hopefully these themes continue throughout the next couple of days.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anita.
Thank you, Will.
So, what we're going to do now is we're going to open this up to questions from the group. So, Steph, I know that you've been kind of monitoring the chat. Do you want to? I think what would be cool if you all are willing is to come off of mute and ask your own questions. Steph, do you want to maybe call on people to go through and then they can kind of ask their questions to Taunita?
Um, I don't want to put people on the spot if they don't want to be on the spot, but the first question was asked in the everyone group chat. So Jody Clank, do you want to ask your question, or would you prefer I read it? I don't mind either way.
I can ask my question. I very much want to be inclusive, but working with high school age athletes, I've come into situations where I've actually had the athlete tell me that trying to hold them to expectations doesn't allow them to be their authentic self. So I'm kind of looking for experience and guidance as to how to help them be their authentic self, but still hold them accountable for their behavior. I guess that's the way I would put it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your question, Jody. The one thing that I didn't share with you all is that after I left the mayor's office, before I came to the University of Pennsylvania, I worked at the Pingree School, K through 12, for 3.5 years. I coached basketball, and I worked in a number of areas: DENIB, HR, people experience. And so I know these young people that you're speaking of pretty well. And, earlier when I shared the work of Erickson, and I was talking about how adolescence is really the fundamental moment where you start to really think about who you are. Some of that pushback we receive is just people figuring out who they are and exploring their identity, right? And how do we find ways to support that while holding up our expectations? I don't want to continue to put you on the spot as we've already have, but I'm left wondering, and I'm okay with, us chatting offline as well, of what those team expectations are, and how they were developed. Sometimes our expectations were developed before the current group of people who are in front of us arrived. And sometimes what we need to do as we're setting these team expectations, and that's what I was talking about when I was talking about that work we could be doing at the beginning of the season, or on team practice trips, or after practice, is pausing for a second and really assessing our expectations and having honest conversation with our athletes about how do they feel about the expectations that we have for them, and what are they truly rooted in? And if they are team expectations that are designed to keep people safe, to keep people ready in the spirit of competition, those are what they are. No different than the workplace, and how we've seen how we are expected to dress in the workplace change, how we are expected to show up to work, right? There was a time where all of us would be at work Monday through Friday. Those expectations have changed for a reason. In most places, what you wear to work, it still matters to a certain extent. You can't come in pajamas, but people had to understand like what my expectations are around suits. They were rooted in something else, particularly standards that were not designed for a group of diverse people, right? And so, I think the short answer of that is to continue to have open and honest conversation, to really with that athlete or other athletes, to see what are they really pushing against, and is it the spirit of just being a young person and, you know, rebelling in the spirit of like, I'm learning who I am, or are there expectations that we'd like or need to change? Hopefully that answers your question and gives some insight. But I think it's really about the dialogue, and our young people are brilliant. And if we create the space for them to share, hopefully we learn more about what the real issue is.
Yeah, I feel like that to some extent gets to the specific example that I'm thinking of. Generally, I'm really communicative about expectations. The part that I feel like I don't do well is continuing to have the dialogue throughout the season.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this actually, the one incident that I'm thinking of right now, it has to do with a new rower. So in that case, they didn't somehow I didn't know that they hadn't bought into all of the discussions that we had had in the previous season. And my role changes between seasons, so I have more control over communicating those expectations during one season versus the other. So it's a little bit of a challenge. But in this case, the person that I'm thinking of was struggling to interact with the entire coaching staff. And basically the feedback was that they felt like the constructive criticism, as I'll put it, was very much asking them to do to act in a way that was contrary to their authentic self. And I'll give the specific example that most of the feedback, this person was acting as a coxswain, and most of the feedback had to do with their tone of voice when addressing both the boat and the coaches. So that was where we were running into issues. I will fully admit that I am not the be all and end all in doing everything that we need to do to make people feel included, but I do feel like in general, my team, the feedback I get from them is that I do a pretty good job of trying to make people feel included. So this one really kind of threw me for a loop because there was no warning that this was happening. It just all of a sudden came out overnight that this is how they felt. And that they were using really strong language, in my opinion, about how it was making them feel. So it was just like this complete blindside that this was going on. So I'm working on it, but thank you for
Of course, and you know, this is ongoing work. Even myself as a practitioner, you know, I don't always get it right. I don't always know all the things. I'm sure I have moments where I don't always create a sense of belonging. Particularly when you're knocking on my door and I have tunnel vision, right? I'll look up and I'll be like, "What can I help you with?" Right? And I'm sure people don't always feel the most welcome with me, and my job is to ensure that people feel included and that they belong at all times. And so I say that to say, I think the biggest thing that we can do is just continue to work on it, and continue to create that space of continuous improvement and asking for that feedback, and then figuring out what does that mean to really change. I did see, and I don't know how much time we have, but I saw Amy said I'd like to ask about inclusive language.
Yeah, we have 8 minutes left before our next speaker. So yeah, if we can move on to that question, that would be great.
Hi, I coach high schoolers,
Amy.
and my question is about we have kids that identify with different pronouns on our team. This example is a kid that goes with she, they. They they chose to be on the girls' team. They race with girls. How do I use inclusive language if I'm talking about them as a group? Because girls is not accurate for they, but also they are racing with the girls, and the events are divided that way by US rowing. Like that is the language. So what do I do?
You could say the people on, the team is the women's team, right?
Right.
The people on the women's team.
So we address the girls' team, but that
Right.
doesn't feel like it's inclusive of they, them.
Correct. So I like to use when I am working with my colleagues, they, them, I like to identify them as people. And that's why I was saying the people who, are on this specific team could work. And then I like to call people by their names. I like, and I know you can't call everyone on that team. I use the word they a lot just in general, right? So if I'm talking about the women's team and then I start talking about them, instead of constantly saying the girls or the women, I will say them or they. And I think that just becomes an inclusive approach. I also think, that when I was speaking about this inclusive language guide or these inclusive language conversations, even in the workplace, we've had moments where, particularly in my work at Penn, because this work specifically for these divisions are new, where we are pausing and having conversation about language. And you can do that individually or you can do that in a group, depending on the readiness. But picking a topic and saying, like, what are the exercises this? What are the words that we should be using, right? And depending on young people, you do have to be careful. So you want to open up with what we should be using. And then you can ask them, are there words or phrases that we should stop using? And of course, you have to, and this is why a trained facilitator is important. You have to set the space to be able to say, this is a safe space. Nobody is using words to harm or judge. If people have questions about the language, we should be able to ask that. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done ahead of time to do that. But ultimately, the norms and the language that we are using in our community should be derived from the community and what they're comfortable with. And not everybody is going to be comfortable with the same thing, but hopefully if we are utilizing language, we're understanding what people deem as respectful to them. And that's why it's hard to answer your question specifically, because I don't know that young person. I don't know what their expectations are. So I don't know if that
Thank you.
helps, but hopefully that gives you some insight.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Amy. Thanks, Taunita, for your answer. Steph, do we have time for one more question?
I think we do. And I had a question that was sent to me directly. So, and I think it's a good question. Let me pull it back up. Do you have any suggestions on how to increase and strengthen diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practices within a team when the larger the umbrella organization is very stuck in quote unquote the way it was?
Read it for me one more time, Steph.
So do you have any suggestions on how to increase like the DEI and B practices within a team when the larger organization is mostly stuck in the way it was? So like anti DEI and B.
Correct. So I think a lot of this work is rooted in some fundamental, important, just day-to-day practices that when I am assessing a lack of readiness of where an organization may be in their DE&IB journey, that I direct the work to other places and then try to interweave it in that. So I might spend time on like communication. And what does that mean in terms of like deep communication strategies like active listening? And then in an active listening session, I may interweave some examples that are relative to DE and IB or scenarios, right? So, I'm thinking off the top of my head about like emotional intelligence. I already mentioned communication, active listening. Self-awareness is a big one that I spend a lot of time in, because in the self-awareness work, we can kind of unpack our identities and how we choose to show up based on different scenarios. So I think there's a number of values driven exercises, and how do we develop our values of who we are as an athlete or a coach or administrator and where they came from, because ultimately our values often develops from some piece of our identity, usually relative to race or religion. And so it kind of opens up the door to have these conversations without saying this is the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Thank you so much, Taunita. We are going to end it right here. I so appreciate your time, your insight. Thank you to the the people who asked the questions. I thought those were really like they threw some good questions your way, Taunita, and thank you so much for your responses and your answers. So appreciate your time, and I look forward to staying in touch. For any of you who are interested in connecting with you, Taunita, is that something that you would be potentially open to via email?
Correct.
Can we put your email in the
Abs-
chat at some point?
Absolutely. And I had a great time with you as well. Well, like leading up to this and even in this space, I appreciate all the questions. Makes me better, and I'm totally open to connecting. And I've had to navigate some situations, particularly in rowing, as some of you may know. So I'm happy to be a thought partner in that work. So yes, I can actually drop it in the chat, but you can share it out as well, Will, in any communications. And I look forward to hearing from some of you all.
Amazing. Well, yeah, we couldn't have asked for a better kickoff to the summit. So again, Taunita, really appreciate it, and yeah, we'll talk soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.